Okay, so we're going to get started with our first open source panel. We're really excited for this amazing group of people to come in here. This is brought to you by Condé Nast Technology. So for those of you who said you're interested in open source, this is a chance to get deeper into it with the people who are immersed in the world of open source technology, okay? So first up, let's give a round of applause for Suze Hinton. Suze is an open source maintainer of several popular JS hardware libraries. She works at Open Source Live every Sunday morning, streams her work via the website Twitch, and she's passionate about open source, accessibility, IoT, and New York City subway. Whoop, whoop. All right. Next up, we have Gautam Arora. Gautam heads developer evangelism at Condé Nast, where he focuses on solving tech architectural challenges, building communities within the engineering team, and leading the company's foray into open source. He's the co-organizer of New York JavaScript Meetup and Node School New York City. So let's give a warm round of applause to Gautam. This one's no stranger. You guys all know Shannon Brill. Shannon is an email developer at T. Rowe Price outside of coding and launching email. She can be found leveling up her front-end development skills in areas of JavaScript, WordPress, and Git. So she gave the amazing talk, so you guys already know about her. And finally, last but not least, our founder and the head, Saran Yitbarek.
Hello again. So good to see you all. Thank you all so much, by the way, for the people who did come up to me and say hi. It was awesome to put some faces, some human bodies to avatars, so thank you all so much. So today we have our very first panel, our open source panel brought to you by Condé Nast. We're gonna do about 20 minutes of Q&A. If you've listened to the CodeNewbie podcast, this is basically gonna be a little live podcast, so you're welcome. And then we're gonna do 10 minutes at the end for Q&A from all of you. So if you have questions, as we're talking, as things are brought up, please feel free to jot them down, keep them in your mind, and I'll have you just stand up and ask your question. Sound good? Yeah? Okay, cool, all right. Okay, so my first question is for Suze. Hi, Suze, how you doing? So, Suze, my question for you is, you do a lot of open source and hardware, which to me is very interesting because I don't really, when I think of open source, I think of software, like mostly web development stuff. What does open source look like when it's in hardware?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I usually describe like open source with hardware as it's almost exactly the same. It's just that continuous integration is a lot harder. And so a big reason why I started doing open source hardware is that I wanted to show people that there's like apparently this hidden world of like stuff that's like way too difficult in hardware, and I was trying to dispel that myth. So I do a lot of JavaScript hardware just to show that if you know a language like JavaScript, you can actually apply it to other things other than things in the browser. And so a lot of my open source workflows, a lot of the actual code that I write looks almost exactly the same as like what you'd write for a browser. You're just writing for like a slightly slower, less powerful computer, I guess.
Does that make it harder? Like a lot harder?
It gives you an interesting set of like constraints that are just different from what you usually do. So sometimes that can be harder if you're used to having like lots and lots of memory on a computer to work with. So you just have to be more creative. Your code has to be a lot shorter, and sometimes you have to get a little hacky. But it's not exactly something that you can't just learn like everything else.
Yeah. So my next question, Gautam, is to you. So when we hear Condé Nast, I think generally we think more like magazines and fashion and media and that sort of thing, right? What does open source look like at a more media type company?
Sure. So I think a quick background. About 3 years ago, Condé Nast started its digital transformation. What that means is we started building all the technology that we are using internally in-house. So our backend is like the CMS is built in-house for all 20 brands. The front end for all our websites is built by our teams. So we started at that point, and about 3 years in, we've been able to migrate all our brands, and we started thinking of what's next for us. And that's where we wanted to think about giving back a lot of the assets that we've built over the years. So that has kind of been the main driver for us in our foray of open source. I feel like the challenges that we faced, as Sue said, it's the same but slightly different. For us, it's kind of the same. We're like, it's open source at work is same as open source at home. It's just that you're doing it at work. And then when you're doing it at work, you take it a little more seriously, which can sometimes work against you, because you might feel like, hey, I'm like, my manager's okay with this, but you take a lot more pressure, like personal pressure on yourself, saying like, this must be the best thing ever. I am representing Condé Nast after all, right? So that can have its hurdles, and that's been an interesting journey where you have to work with the community of engineers and just like have the confidence and build the processes.
So what are some examples of projects that you've open sourced at Condé Nast?
Sure. So we've done about 6 libraries. So the way we've approached open source is you can have 2 ways. You can take a big project and open source it all, which many organizations have done. We are doing it slightly differently in that we are identifying core libraries in our code base, and we are decoupling them from our core CMS or front-end stack and open sourcing them. Some examples of these are, we have a performance tool called Perf Timeline CLI. It's all in the Condé Nast GitHub organization, so you should check it out. It's what our web performance team uses. We've open sourced QuickBus, which is an event library that our ads team uses. We have components from our Copilot CMS app we've open sourced. As an open source manager of sorts, we have a checklist of 30 things you need to do before you open source something. And I kind of hated being the guy who would have to say oh, you forgot item number 15. Nobody wants to hear that. So what we've done is we have a checklist of those 20 things, and that's actually a test checklist. So you have a test runner, you take your repository and you run your repository against that code base, and a lot of stuff that Shannon was talking about earlier, making sure you have a pull request template, making sure you've got a good README and section as we've open sourced even that. So, nice. But that I would say is just the beginning of where our desire is to go. I think this year we'll be doing a lot more.
Very cool. So Shannon, you gave a great talk, but can we give a round of applause for Shannon's awesome talk? That was so good. I was so proud. So my question to you is, when you first heard of open source, what did you think it was going to be like?
Wow, I'm trying to think of when I first heard of open source. I don't remember exactly, but I remember going to my first WordCamp a couple years ago and knowing that WordPress is all open source, and it's this big thing. And so yeah, it definitely seemed like this big kind of nebulous thing. How do I jump in? There's a lot of ways to contribute to WordPress, which is really awesome. But yeah, it just seemed like this big scary thing, but it's out there, but I don't know what to do with it just yet.
Okay, so I'm gonna be honest. When I first heard of open source, I was like, this doesn't make any kind of sense, okay? There's all these people all over the world who are helping. You don't know who they are. They could be terrifying. They could be awful people, who knows? Hopefully their code is good. Hopefully it makes sense. But somehow it works. Somehow we built all these incredible, powerful tools with open source. So as someone who's new and still figuring it out, does it make sense to you?
It does, actually. I was in a training at work, and I think it was about a continuous improvement or something like that, and there was a video, and I don't remember the name of it, but they were talking about that, what if we take the smartest people out there in tech, have them work for free, but on whatever they want to work on, and then have them give it away. And first people were like, no, it's not going to work. But that's how things like WordPress come out of it, right? So it's really, really interesting that if you're kind of, if you're doing your passion project and something that you care about, and you can just give it away after, really great things can happen. So it does make some sense in a weird way.
Okay, all right, I believe you. So, Suze, what I find so interesting about your story is that you live stream your every week, right?
Yeah, every Sunday.
Set at 11?
11 a.m. I might not be this Sunday though, Kathy,
yeah.
sorry. This is actually
a
Sunday that I might take a break.
Okay. And how long have you been doing that for?
It's almost been 2 years. So I started July 2016. Wow. So it's coming up on 2 years soon.
Okay, who thinks that's the most terrifying thing they've ever heard? Because I think that can we do a round of applause for Sue's live stream weekly 2-year? That's amazing. That's terrifying. Really amazing. Okay, so why do you do that to yourself?
I ask myself that every Sunday morning when I wake up. No. I do it because I did a lot of public speaking before this, and people would just come up to me and they would just say, I really like your talks, I feel inspired to do hardware, but I'm just still feeling really intimidated. And they would put me up on this pedestal, whereas I wanted to have the opposite effect by doing the public speaking, but then that's just what happens, And so I watched someone else's, a friend, he was maintaining open source on YouTube Live, and I was learning so much from him because his libraries are super popular and mine are not as popular. So it was really cool to see just the insane amount of stuff that he got done in 3 hours. So I thought that I would do the same just to demystify hardware. And I was hoping also that it would encourage people to contribute back to my repos, that if they saw kind of the friendly face behind the software, that they might actually feel more welcome to contribute.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I started it.
And how have you, I'm assuming you've had some negative interactions on live stream situations?
Yeah, so who's heard of Twitch? Yeah, so Twitch is mostly for live streaming gaming, where you just share the game that you're playing, and then there's a webcam to show your reaction and stuff. And so I actually stream on Twitch. So you get like a gamut of different responses. Probably the most aggressive responses I get are when I'm working on a really old JavaScript library that doesn't have the latest ES6 features, and or just the fact that I'm coding JavaScript is like very offensive to some people. So the worst trolls I've ever had is just people going, "Oh my god, like why are you writing JavaScript?" And like to me, I'm like, that's extremely wholesome. And so there's other people that they sign up for a really rude like Twitch username, and then they'll follow you, and then that comes up as a big like notification, and so they try and trick you into reading out rude words, and like there's all sorts of like really weird.
Sneaky.
Yeah, that's like a thing. So you get halfway through reading it, and then you're like, actually, I see what you did there. Yes. So you do get weirdos, but because like I think that programming is sort of a niche on Twitch, and because I've been extremely intentional behind my community since like day one, where I have rules and I actually have moderators and things like that, my community is easily, like I can say this without a doubt, easily one of the most positive communities on Twitch. So I've been really, really fortunate that they kind of self-govern themselves now.
Very nice. So Gautam, I know we talked about Condé Nast technology, but I want to hear about you personally as your experience with open source. When was your first commit? Do you remember? First pull request? Yeah.
That was about 3 years ago, but it was like a one-off commit. I added an example program. Like somebody had a library, and you could like create a Java version of a program, a Go version, and I contributed the Java version. But it was like I did that, but didn't stick around long enough. But recently I felt like I've found a couple of projects that I'm super passionate about, and they're not Condé Nast projects. These are just like projects that I was very passionate about. And I think what I've found to be different, like I think I'm finally buying into like personal open source now, is that over the years I've built a lot of side projects. So I was like very passionate about side projects. Every weekend I would be working on my passion project, thinking this is going to be the one that's going to be on top of Hacker News. This is the one that's going to get a lot of GitHub stars, and none of that happened. In fact, surprise. I think what mostly happened was I had like a graveyard of side projects, and that's common. That's like everybody gets. I hope that not everybody gets there, but I got there. And recently, my experience has been that I had a similar itch to create something. It's like I'm going to create my own code sandbox, and this was for a project that I was working on. I was like, it's going to be my code sandbox. I'm going to make it like this. I'm going to invest all of this time, and I realized it's going to take me about 2 years to do that. So it's like, great, I'm not going to, like, based on my track record of side projects, that's not going to happen. So I found another open source project, and instead of building my own, I decided to chip in and help. And that has transformed the way I think of open source and how I feel like part of that community. I'm always on their Discord channel. I'm helping folks out with issues. And like, I might not be coding and helping them day to day, but that to me has been a great success personally. And I want to find more such opportunities to give back to open source.
So you mentioned that you started, the first one was 3 years ago, then you kind of like stopped. Why did you stop?
I feel like it didn't, it was more of the fact that I just wanted to do open source. It didn't, like, there was no calling for that project. I just felt like everybody says open source is cool. It's good to put on your resume. So I guess I'll do it too. But then you, like, if you don't feel like part of the community, I feel like one part I would like to say is like we think of open source and we think it's about code. And like more and more I realize open source is actually very little about code, it's about community. So you have to find the right community and not the right code base. So many folks go looking, saying like, maybe I should find a Java project or a JavaScript project. These are the skills I bring. Maybe we need to look at it differently and actually like chat with the maintainers, see how they are. Like, I love the maintainer of like the project that I contribute to. He's amazing, he inspires me. And by the way, he's eyes for Code Sandbox, so he's amazing. And every time I chat with him, I kind of like enjoy being part of the community. So I think that's personally for me a big reason why I'm sticking around.
So Shannon, you did a ton of research on what open source projects you wanted to look into and to try out before you did your own. And I'm curious, did you get a sense that these were different communities? Like, did you get a sense of the people and the values and that kind of thing when you were researching?
You know, it's interesting that you say that. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it makes sense now. I didn't really think of them as, I thought of them as different community as in like WordPress is sort of its own thing, maybe another project is its own thing. There's probably overlap as far as like code base, but yeah, I didn't really think about them so much as terms of community at the time, but now I definitely do.
Yeah. So now that you're thinking about it as communities, and you think about your future open source projects and communities, a community that you might want to grow, what do you think you can do or other people can do to really create a great space for newbies to contribute and for other people to feel comfortable contributing?
That's a great question. Again, the open source guys that I referenced in my talk had a checklist of like, if you have like these 5 things, that's a really good way to kind of put your project out there as being a good open source project. I think one of the top things was having a README or code of conduct. Contributor guidelines are really simple things that I think might discourage some people from contributing. So if you have those and have like, I think also licensing is an important thing to have out there. If you have those out there, people maybe are more likely to contribute. Like they know it's a safe space. You know what happens if people are unruly, and you can go from there. I think it's really important.
Yeah. Suze, you mentioned that your community is really good at policing themselves and making sure everything is cool, so the burden isn't on you. Are those values, those rules, does that come from coding guidelines that you set? Is there like a code of conduct? Like is it a technical thing? Is it a feelings thing? How did you do that?
Yeah, that's really interesting the way that you put it. Is it a feelings thing? And I think it always comes down to that. But there's like a popular culture on Twitch of having like chat rules, and then Twitch actually formalized it as like an actual feature of the site. So when you click into the chat box, to type something for the first time, a little pop-up comes up saying, hey, here are the actual rules of the chat. So you can specify your own custom set. So a lot of gamers might have a set of rules that just say, don't swear, don't be racist, don't be sexist, things like that. Don't troll people. But I have things like no language bashing. You know what I mean? So if someone does come in and say, hey, I can't believe you're running JavaScript, that's grounds for me to suspend them or time them out or even ban them if they
That's
persist.
right, don't mess with Suze.
and so I actually have very specific language towards coding, because that's actually where most of the bad behavior I've seen. There are also things about my appearance, such as commenting on my appearance is usually like just a distraction from what we're actually doing. If you like my t-shirt, you can say so, but don't really comment otherwise. So people are very respectful of that as well. So there is a way to formally do that on the Twitch platform, which is a big reason why I've stayed with that platform, is because those kind of tools really help to formalize that code of conduct.
Tell me about some of the more technical guidelines, because that's another thing too, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the anger and frustration and hostility isn't really about like the people or the community. It's you shouldn't be using JavaScript and things like that. So do you have any technical guidelines, any things relating to code or contribution that have helped shape the larger community?
Do you mean on Twitch or
Or just in general with your own projects?
Yeah, totally. So at least with the chat rules on Twitch, I usually say that I welcome questions and comments as long as they're constructive. And if you're trying to get your point across and I'm not understanding, to send me a gist of that code. And so I have a very similar thing in my GitHub repos as well. I have a code of conduct, and it explains like the best ways to contribute and the best ways to actually be like a kind citizen at the same time.
Yeah. Nice. So Gautam, one of the, I remember, I think it was Jessie Frazzle, who's an amazing open source contributor person who does a lot of, what's it called? Containers, that's what the word. A lot of the container stuff. She's amazing. And I remember she tweeted something some months ago that really stuck with me, where she said, if big companies of enterprise, if they are going to do open source, it's not just about open sourcing their own work, but it's also about contributing upstream and making sure they're giving back to the frameworks that we all use. So how does Condé Nast balance that? Opening up your own libraries and your own stuff, but also making sure that the rest of the open source ecosystem is really being held up?
So that's a great question. In fact, our first foray into open source has been in contributing and giving back. That's why when you asked her, what has Nast open source? I feel like that will happen with time. We will have bigger, better projects. But a big desire from our engineering team, especially given we are using a lot of JavaScript libraries, Node libraries, React libraries, is to give back to these communities. So we organize internal open source hack nights, and that happens every month regularly. And through that, we've made 100 open source contributions over the last year. And these contributions have not been we've not gone after big name projects. These have happened to Mocha, which is a testing library that our team uses internally. It's robot framework, where one of our engineers, she started contributing, and slowly she became the maintainer of that project. So now, she's a co-maintainer, so she has a seat on the table as they're thinking of features, which is a great way in which an enterprise should participate in the open source community. We actually had Hacktoberfest, so internally we ran our own Hacktoberfest. Some of our engineers got some t-shirts, they were hanging around, that's cool. In fact, now we are running open source hack days. So we're taking a full day where we are identifying a feature that we can contribute. Because sometimes when you run a hack night, by the time you've kind of gotten a taste of the project, it's time to leave. And I realized that happened over the last 1 year. So now we're giving a full day. You can find a feature in a key project that Nast is using, and then make sure you've spoken to the maintainer about it, gotten that greenlit, and then you can spend an entire day with a team working on that. And there's a show and tell afterwards, and you can demo what you did. So I think through those events, we are trying to make sure that we are supporting the open source community, as well as we sponsor some of the maintainers and open source projects as well. Because while we can provide contributors, sometimes maintainers need to make money, and they need to think of open source as a career option. So we we want to support them through that as well.
Yeah, very cool. So Shannon, I love the message of your talk, which is that open source can be really serious and really big and rah-rah, or it could just be simple. It could be about bats and really cool fonts, and that's fine too. So I'm wondering, what is your future in open source look like? Is that too big of a question? I think she can handle it. I think she can. What's next for you when it comes to open source? Do you have a big project you want to work on, or a little project?
I had a feeling you would ask. I'm debating, because I guess Hacktoberfest is another 6 months away at this point, so I'm sort of debating a few ideas. I don't know if anyone bullet journals in here, but I definitely have a list of projects to do eventually someday. So maybe I'll dip into that a little bit and maybe find something that could work as an open source project. So as far as something solid, I don't have an idea, but I definitely want to do Hacktoberfest again. I definitely want to continue with this. Whether I'm adding to the BAT project or the countdown timer, I'm not sure, but it'll be up there. So to be continued, I guess.
Okay. We will continue that. I'll see you in 6 months. Yeah, we'll talk. We'll check in then. So now that you've done your first big project that you've maintained, was it everything it was hyped up to be? When I think when Gautam said I did open source because I felt like I had to, because everyone keeps talking about it, and I might as well try. And I'm assuming you came from that same hype, right? Of I keep hearing about it, I should do it too. Was it what you expected? Was it what you thought it was going to be?
Yeah, it was sort of twofold. Like I said, I wanted to get into open source, but hadn't really jumped in yet. I didn't feel pressured necessarily, but knew it was there. It's something I wanted to try, sort of tick off a box on my checklist. But when I did my project, I think I didn't overthink it, and that's a good thing. I wasn't so worried about okay, is this really an open source project? Is this something that's good enough? I just sort of put it out there, and whatever happened, happened. I was really happy about the result I got. So sort of twofold, it's out there and it's a little bit scary, but I didn't overthink it when it came to my project, and I think it worked out for me, so.
Very cool. Okay, so now we're going to open up to some Q&A. Do we have some questions? Raise your hand high, and I'm going to call on you, and you're going to shout, because that's how that's going to work. Okay.
We can repeat the question.
Hi, my name is Lisbeth. First of all, Saran, thank you for the gift that is Codeland.
Oh, you're super welcome.
And my question is for Gautam, for Condé Nast. Okay, so I was actually speaking with Danny earlier out there, and he was talking about how you are trying to give back. That's part of your motivation. But I want to know about the dollars and cents, right? I want to know about the business needs, because obviously you have to pay your developers. You have to be able to fund that somehow. So how are you able to justify the cost of contributing to open source? And in the example where you were talking about one of your engineers who is doing this maintenance, right? Is she doing that during her work hours, or is she doing that during her personal hours? So
great question, yeah, and I think that's.
Did everybody hear the question? No? So the question was, how do you justify open source when it's at a company and you're actually paying the employees? What was the second part of the question?
Oh, and also, like, are they doing it on their personal time?
Are they doing it on their personal time or as part of their workday?
Okay, so first I'll answer the second one. Are they doing it on the personal time or kind of work time? It is work time. In fact, to the point where we ran open source hack time or hack night, which we like hack night, we thought like if we will do it from 6 to 8 or 7 to 8, right? Hey, like business, we're not taking any business hours, this is after hours. But after running it a couple of times, I thought that was the wrong thing to do. Like, if we as an organization are supporting open source, we can't ask engineers to stay back and come over the weekend to do that. So we changed that approach. So after running 2 of them, got some feedback, and we switched it, and now it's actually during work hours. In fact, I'd run a lot of evangelism-related events for our teams, everything from learning how to kind of like code, to blogging, to like anything that happens internally happens during work hours. And we are very sure, like, we have folks that have kids that have to make sure that leave at a certain time. Anytime we get feedback around that, like that is important to me, to the organization, to make sure that happens, right? So that's one. Second, open source itself, it's a complex thing to sell to an organization because there are many facets to it. The first time, like, you start doing open source, folks are like, oh, this is going to be good for recruiting, right? Like, you do open source, you build a brand, you get engineers. I've actively tried to move away from that explanation because that only means that if an organization is recruiting heavily, then only should you do open source, which doesn't make sense, right? Like, that's not the point of it, right? So the way I look at it is, and like, the way like my team looks at it is 2 ways. First, open source means good architecture, good code base. So as I was giving an example of how we are decoupling our code base, it is hard to decouple your code base and like take the guts out and say, we are going to take the guts out and we're going to open source it. Like, that is challenging, but that means your code base is going to be better. Parts that you will extract are valuable, and maybe even if you like do away with the rest of your code base, that nugget of code you'll use for the future, right? So making a case from an architectural point of view. Second, I've noticed that when we have a very strong engineering team and we have a high bar in terms of when we commit code, there are pull requests and there are like code reviews and there's continuous integration, all of that happens. But when it comes to open source, that level of empathy from an engineer in how they write their documentation, in how they set up their project to succeed, is even higher. Like Danny's, you mentioned Danny, who you spoke with, like he recently open sourced like literally the core of what he is building, and that took us time because his bar that he set for himself was much higher for anything else. So I see those values, and we've only done 6 of these. I feel like by the end of this year, if we've done 50 such projects, then we will say, wow, those were important aspects that we have done, and I feel like the buy-in will continue, the business will see the value of that.
Very nice. So we have time for, I think, 2 more questions. Anyone have a question for Suze or Shannon? Raise them high, raise them high, raise them high. Right there. You. Mm-hmm.
Hi everybody. Name is Jason. Quick question. As programmers, we have different ways of writing stuff, and we have different best practices. How do you guys neutralize that when you're doing an open source project?
So meaning, how do you personally get rid of like your own biases?
No, like have one.
Oh, create the standard. Okay, so the question is, how do you create the standard when it comes to coding and best practices when you're doing an open source project? So I'm gonna give that one to Suze. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of developers really like linters. And who's heard of linters before? A few of you, yeah. So linters are basically like a little program that runs in the background and shouts at you if you do your code in a certain way that is not adhering to the standards of that specific like environment you've set up. So you can set up rules if you like things in a certain code style, and that can actually kind of help inform somebody as they're developing in your code base, you know, the actual set way to do things. And then the other side of that is I try to have as an in-depth contributing guide that comments on things that aren't just syntax. So it'll be something like, we're aiming for these versions of browsers, or if you do introduce these features, then we need to be able to like convert the code back to like older JavaScript to work and things like that. So I try and be as specific as I can so that it's really easy for me to point that person at a particular guideline if they open a pull request and it's not quite there yet. There's been times where like somebody just hasn't quite done something, and it will be quicker for me to fix it myself, and they won't really gain anything from that. So sometimes I'll just do it myself as well, just to like keep it in line.
Cool. I think we have time for, I've got 2 minutes. Great. One more question. Any questions for Shannon? Raise your hand. Trying to like not be too biased with this front row. Any? Fine.
Yeah, and I won't stand up for the camera. But my question is, you created a Halloween site, and I'm wondering, how did it become so popular? Like, how did people find out about it, and why were they contributing? It seems like a strange open source type project.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. I'm like, where's the Christmas one?
I thought the same thing.
So the question was, how did Shannon manage to create the Halloween countdown into this really, really popular thing? And he's looking forward to the Christmas countdown.
I mean, I was a little surprised too, admittedly, especially since I started it mid-October. Like I said, I sort of put it out there. Like I think I probably mentioned in every weekly CodeNewbie chat, like what's question number 4, okay? Have this project you can contribute to. I mentioned it in a couple Slack groups that I'm in. I think I might have mentioned it in real life. I'm not entirely sure, but I did a lot of stuff on Twitter using that hashtag for Hacktoberfest seemed to help. And then I was surprised sometimes. I'd get like a notification on my phone at like 2 in the morning that someone like retweeted my link about it to message someone else about it. So it kind of, I think social media helped, Twitter helped, and I don't know, maybe like the buzz around Halloween and candy and that kind of thing might have helped too. So like I'm a little bit surprised, but like I would say Twitter hashtags all day.
When you were sharing it, did you tell people it was your first open source project? Was that like part of the?
I'm not sure, actually. I might have mentioned it. I know I put a blog post up about it. I know I did some notes in my like README file as sort of updates, like, hey, these recent changes are up there. I might have mentioned it, but I'm not entirely sure. Like, it probably was said in the CodeNewbie chat maybe that this is something I'm working on, but I don't know if I really advertised. I didn't mean to hide it necessarily, but I don't know if I advertised it either.
Yeah, very cool. All right, well, that is all the time we have for our open source Q&A. Can we give them a big round of applause? Pretty good.